Well, I want to welcome everybody. My name is Bruce Cain, and I'm the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. And I would like to welcome all of you to the kickoff inaugural ArtsWest event of this academic year. Today, we're really pleased to host Lukas Felzmann. And he's going to talk today about his project called the Conceptual Atlas of California. Lukas is, I think as many of you know, a prolific artist who's had his work published in many books, and not just here, but in Europe and elsewhere. We first partnered with Lukas in 2018 when he was awarded a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. He's been a lecturer in the Department of Art and Art History here at Stanford for over 25 years. He's been an affiliated scholar with us, and he's participated in our ArtsWest program and mentored undergraduate students. So, Lukas has been a really critical person in our arts community here at Bill Lane Center. Lukas will be in conversation today with Jennie Waldow, who is a PhD candidate in our Stanford's Department of Art and Art History. Jennie studies post-war American and European art with a focus on the 1960s and 1970s conceptualism. Jennie's currently at work on a dissertation about an American artist, Alan Ruppersberg, I believe is how it's pronounced. This summer, Jennie advanced her dissertation research and is also a graduate student here at the Lane Center. So Jennie, thank you for joining us, the program today. So the format is that Lukas is going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then Jennie will lead a moderated Q&A for the remaining time. We encourage you to ask questions, and we ask you to do this through the Q&A function, not through the chat, although we'll check the chat, but we appreciate it if you tried to use the Q&A. The program is being recorded and will be distributed next week to all the event registrants and probably put online as well. Okay, with that, Lukas, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for joining us, welcoming you, and just really briefly thank some help that I've had with this project, especially the Guggenheim Foundation, who has been supporting this project, and also the Bill Lane Center for the American West. Really grateful to having been invited to join this illustrious group of scientists, particularly Bruce Cain and Preeti Haymeyer and Stephanie Burbank, who've been working behind the scenes to make all this happen. So without further ado, I'm going to start with this first image that you hopefully all see on your screen. We are in my studio, and you can see a mirror image of that behind me. So this is where a lot of the work takes place right now, because I've been working on this project for about 2 years, and not so bad timing for me being shut down by COVID-19 forced me to, after being out in the field and doing a lot of field work, kind of facing the work in the studio, in the darkroom. And as you can see, I have a very long metal wall with magnets on it. So this allows me to create relationships between the images, to move them around real quickly. Sequencing is a really essential tool in photography. And, the meaning of a photograph is not fixed, even though we'd like to think of the truth in photography. It doesn't really exist. It's really about a relationship and about a situation that we view a photograph in. So as we change the images around the photograph, or how it's presented, or maybe even the scale of a photograph, its meaning starts shifting too. And this is something that I'm working with now and thinking about in the studio. And I think of this work that I'm doing as an archive. And you could say it's a body of work. I really think the word archive describes better what I'm attempting to do, which is to create a physical record of the state of California. It is not attempting to be inclusive in any way. Of course, it is a selection based on my preferences, based on chance, based on whatever is happening. But especially in this time of virtual everything, I think it is very important to have objects to interact with in a physical way. I really crave the idea of holding a book in my hands and flipping through. And for me as an artist, to make prints is, of course, in a way that the peak of the expression is to create a very, very beautiful object that then you have to interact with in real space with your body. So for all those reasons, I've chosen to work almost purely with film. There is many reasons for that, but I like the idea that the archive is not only digital, but also physical, analog in its manifestation. And that also allows me to work in the darkroom, which I think is a wonderful practice. I completely embrace and use and welcome the digital realm. It is a great set of tools that's been added to artists. But this idea, this notion that it's kind of either or, that you have to shed all the other techniques that now we have digital medias that let us do certain things more easily, is really misguided notions. I think what's very exciting about this time is that we can have both of those systems, different ways of making imageries, different ways of picturing the world, and then they can actually flawlessly work together. You can produce a negative, and then in 50 years, you could make a new file of that and scan it to the size and the current format and bring the digital into the new time. So working with analog photography is not old-fashioned. I hate it when I'm out there with my view camera and people walk by and they're saying oh, you're doing old-fashioned classical photography. And I'm usually very nice, but I feel like saying no, get lost. This is contemporary photography, right? Analog might be the new, the new avant-garde, I would say. So making very large prints is one way that I like to work, as well as making small prints. And so the size of the prints in this archive comes from the negative size, which is 5x7, and it gets literally kind of, it's about a process. So do you want to work on the computer and shuffle files around, or do you want to file negatives and have folders and so forth? I really prefer this more physical approach. I keep a notebook and I usually make a quick sketch of the images while I'm in the field, because I actually never see the images until much later. I think, to me as an artist, that's a very helpful thing. I don't think it's that great to constantly look at your camera and decide if this image that you've just taken is good or not. That's kind of a disconnect, because the process of photography is very spread out. So in the field, to me, is a more kind of intuitive reaction to visual stimuli. And I try to kind of shed this whole idea of editing, because that is a more intellectualized approach, and that comes later for me. So the size of the images right now, as I'm working with, is all 5x7, because the camera I use is 5x7. And just gonna briefly talk about the camera. It is important because the camera shapes the kind of image you make, and it shapes the process that you engage with. The view camera that I use just needed some repairs, so I took it apart a little while ago and I made a quick pictures for you to see. We have the bellows here, which is basically a dark cloth that gets mounted between the front and the back standard, and that creates a black box, and it's just an empty black box that gets mounted on the bed of the camera, and then a lens which shapes the image is added on the front, and on the back a glass plate on which the image is projected. and behind which a holder with the film, or it could be a digital plate, would be inserted. What's really great about the View camera is the detail it records is really unmatched. I mean, there's probably some, the super high-end digital camera could match that, but the ease of capturing a huge amount of detail is just wonderful. And in addition to that, the front standard and the back standard are movable. So in every other camera, the lens and the film plane, the focal planes are fixed. So in this camera, you can actually adjust these, and that lets you control the image. So it is one of the most refined tools that you could use today. And it is also quite a difficult tool to use. And that's also something I like, because this idea of easy, which is, once again, what the industry wants us to do, right? Even if you think back on the history of photography, the Kodak's first slogan was, "You press the shutter, we do the rest," right? Well, it really hasn't changed very much. The industry wants you to be able to capture an image, right? Everybody can do it, and that's great. But easy is not an important adjective for me as an artist. I actually like difficult. I like to have some kind of limitations that I have to push against as an artist, because no limitations is problematic, I think. So I'm going to go really briefly through some books that I've made, because the books have been, are in a way a stepping stone, and the work that I'm going to show you really is heading hopefully towards a book as well. Landfall, the first book, was a kind of metaphorical journey through a scarred landscape. What was very intentional in this book was that there were no page numbers and no places that told you where you were, because I wanted the viewer to have to create their own narrative. If you say, well, this is Pyramid Lake, then that always kind of categorizes the image in a certain way. But if you don't know, you have to work much harder and create your own narrative and connect the sequence that you see to your own history, to your own imagination. So the next book, Waters in Between, was then very different in that it looked at a very particular place, the Sacramento Valley. And so it became about place. It became a document of a location. However, as in all my work, I do think about place, but I want the place to be just a jumping board. I want the images, the works, to be outside, about something outside themselves. I want them to be, you could say, metaphors or triggers for some emotional, historical, personal connection. So I think about place, and in this book, John Berger wrote the text, and he brought in also a writer from the 17th century, Angelus Silesius, who was a doctor of philosophy and medicine. And on this page, he kind of combined his own and Silesius's writings. I'm just going to read this real briefly. It says, "Place and word are one." And then John says, "From the human capacity to arrange, to place, come language and communication. The word place is both verb and noun, the capacity of arrangement and the capacity to recognize and name a site." And then Silesius, "And without place, in an eternal eternity, there will be no word." So what is place, and how do you picture that and transport into the something outside that place is really what I'm thinking about in this new project. Back to some other books in that same place, Waters in Between, I also made a book called Swarm that looked at the movements of red-winged blackbirds. And these beautiful kind of, I think of them as also almost hieroglyphs in the sky, some kind of language that maybe we understood once but cannot understand anymore, was something that I was thinking about, this sense of that in nature there are systems that can achieve something without a leader, which is something we maybe knew once, but we can't anymore. We always have this kind of ladder. So the concept that there is control without a hierarchy is something that I think is very fascinating and maybe worth thinking about and contemplating for us. Together, the two books form a conceptual pair because they were both made in the same place, Sacramento Valley. One is looking down at the ground and the other one is looking up into the sky. So together they formed Sky Ground. The following book is called Juju, and it was photographed on the Farallon Islands, looking at the geological conditions, the animals, and the scientists, or maybe more the methodologies that the scientists employed to observe nature. And it is a little bit a book of archives in itself. It contains a list of species of animals and plants. And then it also contains an archive that is the Juju archive. And these are all objects that Western gulls have swallowed on the mainland, flown to the Farallon Islands, and then regurgitated in their nests. And the scientists that monitor the nesting habitats find them and they threw them all in a box and said, Juju archive, we don't know what to do with this. And I was fascinated. It was like, oh my God, of course, this is our shit coming back through the stomach of a bird. And I ended up photographing all the objects they had found without editing them because the gulls had already made a selection. And then most recently a book called Apophenia, which again plays with the sense of the archive. This time, two archives. One is the mail that my father kept, everything that was sent to him. And from that archive, I culled vertical postcards, and I combined them with images from my archive, all vertical images that I had never published before. So it was this kind of play of two unrelated archives and try to make them sing together, if you want to call it that way. And the word apophenia is an expression coined by a doctor who was looking at patients that were having this condition, and it really describes the innate urge of our brain to make relationships between unrelated patterns, right? And I think it's not just something that, might be considered an illness. I think it's actually our way of understanding. This is how the brain works. It sees different things, they might be unrelated, and it's looking for connections to create a narrative to understand the world around us. So Apophenia was this book of playing with these different images. And that's the lineup of the books. There's another one, and this really leads me right into the first image I'd like to show you from the current project, a conceptual atlas of California. Okay, so this is kind of the concept in the beginning, like you have to come up with a box and then you have to try to fill that box, and then maybe the content of that box changes the title on the box. I'm still working with that, but I created this kind of scenario that would let me allow to go out and now spread out from previous points, the Sacramento Valley, Farallon Islands, to go all over the state and photograph. I started 2018 and I wanted to go north at first, but then big fires broke out. It was during the Car Fire, and I ended up going south. And this is my, maybe, one of the very first images. It is at Devil's Slide, south of Pacifica. And I like it because it already contains a lot of what the work will contain, is the idea of travel, of passages, of blockage, the road, the display of geological features, the kind of interplay of the natural and the cultural. And also, I realized that even being very far away from the fires, the atmosphere had changed, and it created this really amazing, soft, sumptuous light. Now, you know, after if you have experienced some of the crazy apocalyptic skies in the Bay Area, as we all know that, but I was realizing that you could be very far away from this, and it already changed the conditions. And so I was thinking, well, where am I going to go, right? Where am I going to photograph? California is a big state, and what I decided was that I kind of want to go everywhere. I have this notion of that every place is interesting. I would like to go to Yosemite, but I really don't want to re-photograph Half Dome. I don't want to re-photograph the Golden Gate Bridge and the Redwoods. I want to photograph other places, and in particularly not places that are very dramatic and maybe very beautiful, because I think that we have this problematic notion that nature is this great dramatic, you know, wild thing, a la National Geographic with predators hunting and explosions and all this stuff. And even though that is part of it, a lot of nature is very calm, right? You might go and nothing happens, right? Does that make it not interesting? Well, no. And this is where the problem comes in, that we're starting to think of nature as entertainment rather than this great, you know, force that's all around us. So I decided I wanted to go to places I might not want to go, right? Not just where I think there's good images, but other places. And I thought, I'm going to put a grid on California and then go to all the squares. And then I realized, well, there is a grid already, and it's the counties. So I ended up saying, I'm going to photograph in every county of the state. There are 58 counties. And that will make me go to all the sections of the state. Now, I don't feel like I have to represent each county, but I like to enter the terrain of each and then spend some time and try to make work. I think for me, good photographs happen when I spend time, when I'm, you know, in the present, in the moment, and not rush things. So as I was going to all these counties, I thought, well, I should bring something constant back from each one. And I decided to make a series of photographs called county grounds. So in each county, I'm photographing the ground, and the ground might be solid or it might be liquid. There might be solid ground underneath this wonderful, you know, surface of wavelets. Once again, I'm not trying to represent each county, but each image should have some kind of like relationship to something that's essential of the county. It might be natural, it might be cultural, it might be a combination of both, which is really what interests me the most, is how we shape our environment, how we try to control nature. And these kind of border areas, the, you know, liminal spaces of change are something that really interest me. So first I was going to show you all the county pictures today, but I think that might get a little difficult to look through. So I'm going to show you just about 7 or 8 of them. And then I'm going to show you some other images that I'm going to weave around these, because these, the county grounds, are in a way the backbone of this project. They are kind of the conceptual atlas. Now, as I said, I'm not trying to be inclusive. There is still a very selective collection of images. I think of them as a kind of sampling, a kind of topographical sampling of all parts of the state. How I'm going to present them, I don't know. This is something I'm struggling with right now. I've talked with Sasha Landauer a little bit about it, who has worked a little bit with me through the Bill Lane Center. And we were thinking we could invent a narrative of a fictional character for each county. We could also just provide some facts about each county. For example, this is Alpine County. And I could say Alpine County is the 8th smallest county in the state, and it has no dentist offices, ATMs, traffic lights, or high schools. I don't know. San Bernardino County. And then north of Susanville in Yuba County. So as I'm going to each county, these ground pictures are also a beginning for me. I'm there, I'm saying, I'm standing here, I look down, they're all without a horizon, they're looking down at the ground, and then I go and look around and see what else I can photograph. This one is Shasta County. In the middle you see these wonderful pools. It's made in Clear Creek Gorge, and it's one of a really important salmon spawning habitat. So as I'm going to these counties and kind of creating this sampling of all sections of the states, I thought, well, I should also go to the extremities. So now this image is made, this is the most western part of California. It's Cape Mendocino in Humboldt County. And behind this little mound you see there is Sugarloaf Island. It's the most western island of California. The lowest part of California is much more well known. This is, of course, in Death Valley. It's called Badwater. What's interesting is that the highest point in California is only about 88 miles away, Mount Whitney. And the highest and the lowest point in California are actually also the highest and lowest point in the United States, with a difference of about 15,000 feet, only 88 miles apart. I haven't made it up to Mount Whitney yet, but this is the most eastern part, slice of California. This is maybe 10 miles south of Parker Dam. I'm standing in Arizona. I'm looking across the Colorado River into what's called the Whipple Mountains of Eastern California. So these are all maps. This will kind of, every photograph is in a map. This collection of photographs is some kind of map. I'm thinking that maybe conceptual atlas might not be the best word. Maybe it's going to be a empirical atlas, because actually, in essence, I'm not a very conceptual artist. I believe that usually images that come out of my intuition, out of my kind of visual looking, my just being in the space and thinking about sculpture and photography, are more interesting than the images that come out of a conceptual box, some kind of concept. So when I go out, even though I had some ideas and a concept, I actually throw that all out, and I just try to be in the moment and intuitively react to what visually stimulates me. Then, as I collect all these materials into an archive, a more conceptual, more intellectual phase comes back as I start looking at the work and edit it and so forth. This is called Serena's map. And this young girl made a wonderful map of California with pebbles that she painted and peas and some paper. The most southern part of California gets us right up against the border fence. So now we're looking at the border of California to Mexico. That's Tijuana in the background, the Tijuana Valley. And the fence, of course, is a fascinating issue that is not just environmental, but political and ethical to my mind. I look at the fence not just as this fence of California, but I really look at it as a fence that divides humanity. And I can't help think about this idea of keeping things in, keeping things out, right? The ghetto in Europe, Israel, Palestine. There's a long history of divisions that bring up ethical questions in the end. So I look at it as a metaphorical place as well as an actual place in the state of California. Here we are a little bit further east in the desert near Jacumba. You can see a border patrol car back here, and also all the sections of the different fences have numbers. So I surmise that when they see somebody trying to cross, they can say, you know, 157 is where they're coming in. Let's go get them and divide them up, right? So a really emotional place for me. Also a place very charged in terms of kind of sculptural interactions into the land. And that's something that always interested me. I actually think of photography as being a very sculptural medium. I'm going to go to the next image, which is not a fence, but it's called cage. So it plays into this idea of containment, of a cage, of a division. And there are other images in this section of the work that I'm doing that I call liminal spaces. A liminal space is a place in space or in an activity where something changes rapidly. That's a borderline, it's a border place. And I started using the view camera in different ways than it was intended to. I was talking about the front and the back standards being movable, and that's how you can control the perspective of an image, right? So I'm looking up at this fence, and these pillars that really would be receding because of perspective, I can straighten out with the movement of the camera. And also I can create more depth of field with the movements of the camera. So that's another reason why the camera is the view camera is such a great tool. It's not only the amount of detail it captures, it's that it really lets you control the image and shape how shapes appear on the photograph. So I started kind of going the other way, not the way you're supposed to do to make a photograph. As artists, we're encouraged to break the rules, and that's something I've also been mulling about. As scientists, you're encouraged to actually follow certain very rigid standards, right? If you have a hypothesis, you're gonna prove, and you have an experiment, your fellow scientists have to be able to redo that experiment and come to the same conclusions. Otherwise, the proof that you're furnishing is not accepted. So there's a very rigorous path. And then even better, all the scientists work together in a way, right? There's this like wonderful community that shares its knowledge, and then other scientists build upon that. Well, you know, we as artists are kind of a little bit pitted against each other. And that, of course, is complete nonsense. That comes from the industry again, from the gallery world and the collectors and the museums, because they want to see, they think each artist is this like individual entity that does something that nobody else can do, right? Where in truth, we are connected as artists, and we do build upon other artists' work. We do study the history of art, and, you know, even copy other artists, right? And then transform that into something new. So this idea that that breaking the rules of engagement is something that's in art, and that's very interesting. And so that led me to kind of think differently about how the view camera might render something. The line of head, the line of heart, the line of health, the line of life, right? This is what it is all about. And architecture is something that comes into this body of work because it is just all around us. But once again, I also really like not just the grandiose statements of the modernists, but this kind of vernacular architecture where a parking lot becomes transformed into something really beautiful or interesting. Here is a building by Frank Lloyd Wright, the interior of a clinic in Monterey County. It's called Puzzle because somebody was making a puzzle down there, and the puzzle starts mimicking the cutout of the architecture. I think, to me, the most interesting pictures are pictures that have a polarity, pictures that are not just about one thing, but pictures that point different directions. And then those two, whatever, entities, visual cues, start creating some kind of dynamic. And that's something that really interests me. This is a footbridge by Calatravas up in Shasta County. Or something, you know, you could call it just vernacular architecture, or just a strangely beautiful, bizarre building. This is in Glenn County, and right where I'm standing, the road is making a really sharp left turn. And I was standing there making this picture, and the man who lives in this house came out and he's like, "Oh, you like my house, huh?" And I said, "Yeah, I really like how you integrated that tree into your architecture." And he said, "Well, do you know why that's there?" And I'm like, "No." He said, "Well, the kids out here, just they drink all the time, and they come late at night, and they miss the curve, and they slam into my garage and destroy the building. So I just put a tree trunk there." Pretty good. What is beautiful? That's something that I've struggled with for a long time. I certainly have a good dose of, I don't know, shall we call it, German romanticism in me that I probably held back for a while, because in graduate school we were told that's not very cool, but I'm letting it out now. So here's something more in a traditional maybe way of the beautiful. What is beautiful? You know, it's beautiful when you start forgetting the subject matter. And is this beautiful? This is a magazine that I found blowing in the wind in Lake County. It is an issue, it's the bathing suit issue of Sports Illustrated. Is this beautiful? And even more so, how do you photograph something that's terrible, right? You have to make a photograph that is attractive in some kind of way, otherwise nobody will look at it. So here is a fuselage of an airplane that crashed. How do you picture that? How do you picture the terrible? Is it okay to make a beautiful image of the terrible? This is a super site. It's one of the most polluted places in the country. It's a former sulfur and mercury site in Lake County, which is right on the shore of Clear Lake, leading into the lake. Clear Lake is the biggest lake in California, natural lake. It's not as big as Lake Tahoe, but it's entirely within the border of the state. And so how do you picture that? You know, how do you approach that as an artist? There have been a lot of very beautiful aerial photographs of test sites, right? And I really struggle with this notion of aestheticizing the terrible. In addition to that, I'm struggling with color, because color is just so elusive, but yet it is so powerful. I can't deal with the green and blue in the landscape. That just makes the images, I'm not really interested in traditional landscape photography. I'm more interested in creating a really emotional space that might be landscape or architecture or whatnot. So I really overexposed the film, and when you bombard film with a lot of light, it starts failing and not really rendering the right color and becoming, in this case, very red and very dark. This makes me think of the idea of darkness which is a wonderful part, by the way, of the analog process. So when I'm on the road here, I have to continuously create a dark space because I have to download and upload the film into my plates. And so I can do that in it's called a dark bag, but it's kind of problematic. So usually what I do is try to create a dark room or a dark space in often a Motel 6, because their architecture is very much the same in each building. So the bathrooms always face inside and there's no window. So it's easy to make it dark. So as I'm out there in the light capturing this luminosity, I also have to go into the dark, and in complete darkness, there's no red light because film is polychromatic and you can't see any colors. So just by feel, I have to upload and download my film. And you could think of it as kind of a pain in the ass, but it really is also something that provides a wonderful rhythm, right? It slows you down. I'm going out to capture light, and then I have to go back into the dark to save that. And once I'm home, I have to go into the dark again to develop the film. And then I have a negative, and then I have to make it dark again and create a projection in the dark, right? Which is also a kind of sculptural event to turn everything back into a readable photograph. This is an image from the Carrizo Plain that just erupted in a wonderful bloom last year. And then on the right, some gels that I brought in, like what happens to yellow flower if you put a magenta or blue gel in front of it. Besides color, there is scale, of course, that is a really important part of photography and that I think about a lot. The scale of the photograph itself, how big and why. I think we live kind of in an age of unquestioned photographic enlargement where everybody makes the prints big because we can. What does that mean and how does that change the relationship of the viewing body to the image? But also, when you make a photograph, you're compressing the three-dimensional world, or you could call it four-dimensional if you add the time factor, onto a two-dimensional surface. So something that's very far away now comes forward, compressed onto a two-dimensional surface, and everything is equally far away from you. So something that's far away is now as important as something that's near. In addition to that, you can create or almost force a relationship between different objects near and far, and that's a really important tool for how you work in the field. And once again, to me, that is a sculptural activity, because it's not, yes, the photograph is two-dimensional, but me, the photographer, dancing around with the camera, trying to create relationships, is really a dance that takes place in the three-dimensional, four-dimensional world. Color, architecture, those are all themes. Animals, and also images of things, or kind of side things, like voices that I'm now finding in the archive as I'm going through. Animals, painted, animals alive, animals dead, paintings, inscriptions, an unfinished painting maybe, because we're an unfinished society, political manifestations, or almost, I think of it as a typology of the common man, right? And actually, I call this section, I have these like titles for different sections in the archive, messages from the people, hope. Or the future is black, a recent picture from San Francisco. This could be my grand picture for San Francisco. I'm not sure yet. I have another one I really like, so I'm contemplating right now. Welcome to America. Or Yes, yes, y'all. I like this one. So the fires is something, of course, that's been on my mind from the beginning when I set out to make that first picture to the current situation. And I decided, though, that I don't need to go. I think the journalists do a really wonderful job to be embedded with the fire department and making these amazing images. And once again, my struggle is, how do you photograph the terrible, and how do you deal with the emotionality of this destruction? And what happens when you see this amazingly beautiful pictures of houses in flames? So I've gone into fire areas a year afterwards and looked at kind of the regrowth and what happens afterwards, how something good can come out of destruction. However, sometimes things just happen. And I was photographing in San Diego County in the harbor of Oceanside, and this fire just broke out around me. And before I was there with my view camera, before the fire department, shut everything down, I was actually just in the middle of this fire photographing. So there are some pictures of the fire. This whole environmental degradation that we're creating has to come to an end. We have to come to some kind of sense about it and figure out how we deal with that. I think what I could hope for as an artist is to create images that make us pause, that make us think about where we're going, make us reflect on how we might be able to leave this terrain, this beautiful country, this world behind for the generations to come without regret. And I think we might already have messed up on that. So where we're going, I don't know, but I know that maybe we also have to start thinking about the present in a different way, rather than this was the hottest summer on record and the worst, the most destructive wildfire season. We should think this was the coolest summer of the next decade and the most manageable fire season of the decades to come. And I'm gonna leave you with this image of a old oak tree, fallen but still growing in this liminal space, maybe looking back at us. Thank you. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jennie, and we can then maybe talk about some things, and we'll take some questions.
Yes, so thank you so much for that wonderful talk. If people have questions, if you could please write them in the Q&A box, and I'll read them as they come in. But just to kick it off, I wanted to ask you, so you've written about how you see book projects as not simply reproductions of your work, but these unique sculptural objects that are able to circulate, to be held. And so I was wondering, why did you feel that the form of an atlas was useful for this particular project?
Well, the atlas is, of course, one particular kind of book. So the idea that the archive is not, and this is not to say that's not good, not only a digital archive, but a physical archive that is bound and selected already. And through that gives the opportunity for the work to be held, right? I like the idea of this most of these images are really expansive, large landscapes, to have kind of this intimacy with the work, where you're not in a library where you're supposed to be very quiet and, not touch anything, or in a museum where you feel like, okay, I'm now looking at these great works of art. So this kind of like intimacy and this looseness of a bound atlas and a book is something that I think makes the work very accessible.
And you mentioned that you had some ideas for sections. It was Messages from the People was one. What are some other sections that you see forming?
Well, the ground pictures. So the county grounds would be kind of like a section maybe in the middle, and then around this, or maybe woven through them, would be the other sections, messages from the people, animals, the beautiful and the terrible could be one, architecture. You know, am I going to name them like that? Maybe not. Maybe those are just tools for me to shape this kind of weaving of themes. I think of it almost like a fugue, a kind of musical interaction of different melodies. Am I going to name it like that? I'm not sure. I'm actually not even going to, I think I'm going to pull out the name California of this whole project, because in the end, I'm more interested in just our relationship to the natural, rather than saying this is something that happens in California, because, you know, it just makes it a lot more easy for people to relate to in other places, rather than thinking, oh, that's California, that's over there. It's burning, right? It's not me. So I really wanted to be more about everything in a way.
And then I have a process question.
Yeah.
You said that for the counties that you would spend time there. And I was wondering, what did that entail for you? Was there a certain amount of, like the same amount of time for each place? Was it talking to people, going to certain places that you'd picked out in advance? What did that entail before you felt like you could move on?
It means to, I don't talk with people, I'm just kidding. Sometimes I do. And when I, you know, it's a very solitary kind of process that I engage with. So I go with this heavy camera and I kind of stop and I try to be there fully. That could mean moving, walking, driving, whatever that is. But it means to just be kind of open to any kind of indication of something that I feel could lead to an emotional image. Sometimes when I talk with people, I hear stories or they tell me something, and I write those down in my notebook as a kind of a reference, or maybe something that will be brought in to the book as well. But as I said, I try to, when you photograph people, it becomes more of a portraiture. It becomes about the individual. And I'm much more interested in what we do as a society, like not, you know, Joe the farmer, but what are the marks? What are the shapings and the influence that Joe the farmer leaves behind on the surface of the land?
Thank you. So we have two questions. So let's see. A question is, how do you decide when to shoot color or black and white, or do you shoot both in some locations?
Yes, good question. There's no theory about it. Sometimes it's just an intuition, like this is a color image and I put color in. Sometimes I'm like, this is just like, you know, looks like color photography and I put black and white in. Or I feel like this image heads much more towards a metaphorical space, and I feel black and white can maybe furnish that better. Sometimes I'm not sure, and indeed I do photograph, put in, this is another great thing about the disadvantage of single sheets, but I could put in a sheet of color and a sheet of black and white. Often, you know, I don't have that much film, so I'm limited. And once again, that limitation is also kind of nice, because even though you think the greatest thing would be just to have, you know, endless digital storage and I could shoot and shoot and shoot. So I have to think, well, I got 10 sheets of film, what am I going to do with that? And I kind of like that limitation. So sometimes I make an image in black and white and then make a slightly different version in color. And then later on, as I look at them, often it becomes kind of clear, like I tend to like one image much better a certain way, but I often don't really know, and I just kind of see what happens.
Great, thank you. Let's see, another question is sort of a technical question. I was wondering what the model of your camera with the bellows is, or do you use multiple cameras of this design?
What model? The camera is called the Deardorff Camera, and it was built in Chicago in the 50s. this was actually very cool. I bought that camera, you know, at a flea market a long time ago, and at one time it broke, and I thought, how am I gonna clean it and fix it? And I looked up Deardorff cameras, and I found the phone number, and this crackly voice answered, and I'm like, I have this camera, it's called the Deardorff camera. And the voice says, yes, I'm Jack Deardorff. And so it was Jack Deardorff, and he like said, what's the model number, what's the number on the camera underneath? And he's like, I built that camera in, you know, June 23rd in 58. And so it's really a wonderful interaction. So it's just a 5x7U camera made by Deardorff. They build cameras like this currently too. So this is not, I mean, this happens to be an older style camera, but there are new manufacturers who make these cameras because they're such a great tool and they are such a high quality, but yet very, very simple apparatus.
Oh, we have a question from Preeti. Hi, Preeti. How has this project changed how you think of the American West?
Well, one thing certainly that I muse about is how big the West is, you know, even just California, because I physically now have driven into every kind of, you know, extremities all the way north, all the way east, all the way south. And it is just so big, and there's so much unpasteurized space that there seems to be this, you know, you have this hope, you think there's so much forest and there's so much, you know, natural land. We gotta be able to, like, you know, turn this thing around. And of course, as now we live in this amazingly, you know, terrible time in terms of climate change, I realized that how connected everything is, and that size maybe is, you know, not so important, and how important it is to realize that it is not just the grandiose places like Yosemite that need to be protected, but that we need to think of the hill behind our house as special, and every blade of grass, and so kind of realize this connectiveness. And I think so what I, you know, the way it's changed is that I've feel even more in love with this territory, but I also am just really scared what's going to happen and what is going to be left for the following generations.
Absolutely. So we have another question. It seems like the blackbirds are a different kind of subject than much of the other work in respect to the dynamic speed and motion of the subject. So I guess that's referring to Swarm. I'm wondering how the compositional process differed or did not between the blackbirds and the other subjects.
Well, it is very different because that's the only work where I work with a smaller camera, because there's no way that you can follow them with a big camera. First of all, the blackbirds are very small birds. And if you've ever pointed a camera, even at a big bird, a hawk, it appears like a little dot. So they're very hard to capture. They are very, very fast flyers. And so it is more of a reacting thing. And in terms of composition, it's also a kind of, if you look at, you know, that book, and it's in essence kind of black dots in the white page. So for me as the artist, when I made that work, I thought actually a lot more about painting, even though it includes speed. I was thinking, looking at people like Klein or, you know, it really becomes about dark and light and how to fill the space in different interesting compositions with that. So it's a very quick, intuitive kind of compositional thing about balance, where the other work is more, there's more subtleties that you can play with, and you have more of a kind of, you know, you have more time to do it, basically.
We have a question from David Kennedy. Who are the photographers, living or dead, that you most admire?
Living, Trevor Noland, I think. Who else do I really like? There's so many. I really kind of don't have favorites in terms of the history of photography. As an artist, I've studied it very, thoroughly. As a teacher, you have to go beyond of what your likings are. So you have to find ways into people's work that might not be the kind of work that you like or do. So I've really looked at a lot of different work. I could point at Robert Frank or Robert Adams or Linda Connor. I look at painting a lot, I look at Richter, and I looked at Paul Klee. I grew up with looking very, very intensely at Giacometti because his foundation is in the town that I grew up with. So not just photography, but painting and sculpture as well. Yeah.
Okay, let's see, we have a question in the chat. You mentioned embracing a natural proclivity for romanticism. How do you negotiate around the romantic apocalypse, if you will, seeing beauty in somewhat wrecked landscapes? And then it goes on, but anyways.
Yeah, I think I brought that up a little bit. I don't know how I reckon it. It's something I struggle with. It's something that this notion that you have to aestheticize the terrible to bring it into the realm of art. And that is not something new. It's not a singular thing in photography. You could think about Caravaggio, making an amazingly beautiful painting of somebody being beheaded, right? How does that function? How does the narrative develop in this realm of the beautiful and the terrible? Obviously, they are related and they're not exclusive. The question is, how do I, as an artist, not kind of take advantage of that in some kind of unmoral way? That's more of where I'm struggling, and I don't have a real answer for that. Something that kind of comes up again and again.
So I have another question. So you talked a little bit about how you see photography in a way as a sculptural medium, and you've had past pieces that integrate sculptural elements and projections. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you see this particular project as relating to sculpture or not.
Yeah, I started out very much as a kind of straight photographer looking at landscape photography and street photography. And then out of this interest in sculpture, started making installations. And so in the 80s and 90s, I really worked more with projections, camera obscura pieces, creating sculptural installations in the landscape or bringing natural materials into the museum or the gallery. But they always had some kind of connection to photography. There was a photographic element, if that was the projection or if that was some other way. And so then in the 90s, installation art became very, very, kind of hip, and everybody was doing it. And every photographer was like, hanging their pictures in not a straight line, and then there was an installation. And in the end, I felt like the photographic part of these photographic installations started kind of losing the punch of what we've learned through the history of photography. And I said, okay, I'm going to go back. I want to reinvent just the photography part and just make pictures. I want to make good pictures again. That has, kept me busy since then, because it is a very difficult undertaking. It's very easy to make a good photograph. Everybody can do that. As a matter of fact, you could take a camera and spin it on some kind of timer, and it would capture an interesting image eventually, because reality is interesting. But to make several good images and then to create something interesting, a sequence out of the several good images, becomes very difficult. And I talked a little bit about this idea of sculpture, that as a photographer, it's this kind of dance within a four-dimensional reality to create relationships that then work on the two-dimensional plane. So the the sculptural part takes place mostly in the making, in the field, but then in the studio again, I think of a book, as you mentioned, as a sculptural object that you go through. And I actually even making a print in the darkroom is a sculptural activity to create a projection in space, once again, right? And then out of that, drawing something two-dimensional. So I think the twos are really intertwined, and just to think that photography, because the picture is two-dimensional, is a two-dimensional art is actually a little bit misguided, because looking at that as a person, you're already back in four-dimensional space. So it's that kind of back and forth that's really interesting about the two mediums to me.
Another question I have is, you talked a bit about how you come up with a concept, but that it's sort of flexible in a way. And I was wondering, how has that worked with different projects? Have you ever started off with an idea, you've gone into the field, into the world, and it's totally altered, or is there normally sort of a kernel that remains?
I think it's been a little different from project to project, but I certainly have had a project where it has really altered. I mean, Swarm was one that started in the field, where I made a picture of these flocks, and I thought, this is a great concept. I want to create this kind of narrative of all these flock images flowing into each other. And so I would go out into the Sacramento Valley, and I couldn't find them anymore, or the pictures didn't turn out, or they were sitting right next to me in the grass and I couldn't see them. So I spent all this time in this huge plain and I couldn't come up with any pictures. And then I started actually shifting and like, okay, here I am, what else can I do? And I started looking at the ground rather than the sky, and waters in between, which is about the Sacramento Valley, really came out of not finding the birds and starting to look for something else. So sometimes there is an idea and it shifts. I think it usually does. And as I said, I'm not a very concept-driven photographer. So the concept, the idea are just kind of springboards to get me out into a certain situation. And then I usually try to like let go of that and see what else happens. And that's kind of my working methodology.
Another question I have is, how has your relationship with California or the West, how has it changed the longer you've lived here?
Well,
or has it changed?
Yeah, I mean, first when I came and I grew up in Europe, it was kind of like this really foreign landscape, right? The Sierras, the mountains were something that connected and reminded me of my upbringings, the Alps, for example, but certainly the ocean. And then on the other side, the deserts were something completely foreign. And probably, 80–90% of the first decade I was here, I spent in the deserts, because that was just a fantastic place to explore. That was like nothing that this kind of expansiveness, the openness of the ground was really amazing. And now through the years, as I've traveled and lived and, walked these areas, they're not foreign to me anymore. They actually feel like home. So what has shifted is that I rather look at California and the West as this kind of foreign or like lunar or strange landscape. It is really kind of what you could call the home ground that I embrace, and out of that kind of different relationship. I have a child who was born here, right? So there's roots now. So it's more the kind of emotional attachment to the territory that has changed for me.
And then let's see, it looks like you don't have any more questions, so I'll ask a final one. And to stay on theme, how do you know when you're done with a project, especially something like this that is so tied to current events? How do you stop, or do you stop? Do you revisit things?
I don't stop. I think I think it's a very good question. Sometimes I feel like there is a kind of pressure from the industry to be done, because the galleries would like to see a body of work that's finished, and then they present it, and then they would like the new body of work. And I've actually had a falling out with the gallerist who presented me, because the birds were going on for over a decade, right? So he was saying, well, we've shown the birds, what's the new body of work, right? That's not new. And I'm like, well, it is new, I just made it, right? It's a variation on a picture, but it's still new. And he's like, well, I'm a contemporary gallery, I have to present new bodies of work. And my answer was, well, if you represented Cézanne, would you go tell him not to paint Saint Victoire anymore, right? So sometimes there is just kind of an emotional pause, and you're done with something. Like the Farallon Islands, I could not go anymore because there's no more access. So it just kind of takes care of itself. But in much of the other work, I feel like it's not like I finish something and then something new comes. I feel like there's a continuous breath that might change, right? Changing to a different approach, or what you look at, or how you go, your process changes, you yourself change. So it does change. But I often feel that it is all one big soup that gets stirred through the whole life, and I'm never done.
Well, thank you so much for this talk, and to the Lane Center for hosting us. And yeah, just thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody who checked in for attending. Thank you, Jenny and Bruce and the Bill Lane Center.